Hi, my friends. Welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, your host, and also an indie author. I'm thrilled you're joining me today for another fun interview with a passionate author. We're going to kick off this show with an exciting reading, so let's get started.
Hi, I'm Jaye Viner. I'm a Midwest-based author, mostly writing speculative fiction that hasn't been published yet, but I do finally have a book published that was lauded by Publishers Weekly as great for fans of Margaret Atwood. So I guess I'm officially an actual speculative fiction author, which is very cool. My debut romantic thriller, Jane at Battery Park, is a little bit like Romeo and Juliet. If you think of the Juliet character, has a family that puts celebrities on trial for their sins, and the Romeo character is a has-been heartthrob actor who comes from Hollywood royalty and is trying to restart his career, will also fall in love. And it gets really complicated when their various families figure out that they're in this relationship. So today I'm going to read an excerpt from chapter 3 of Jane at Battery Park, which is what I like to call the day in the life of Jane that you don't really want to ever have, where she's doing her regular routine, but things are not going well and you kind of feel like she's about to go off the rails. The traffic in LA was reason enough for even the most skilled person to lose their mind. But Jane liked the traffic. It made her feel like she was part of something. She had plenty of other ways to lose her mind, like phantom husbands in restaurants, eating fast food every day, a habit that made her life in LA feel impermanent. She wiped at fallen shredded cheese and lettuce in her lap as she drove to work and resolved to do more cooking at home. Sleep deprivation was another way the darkness crept in. Coming home from a hectic night shift at the hospital, a spider had found Jane. Fuzzy and black, its body the size and perfect roundness of a quarter, it had dodged her flying shoe and made for the bed where it hid itself in the clutter. And Jane hadn't been able to work up the courage to go in after it. 6 hours on the Goodwill couch in the living room without light blocking curtains did not a happy Jane make. The ticking of the AC unit felt menacing. The sounds of the neighbors' footsteps outside were portents of doom. The spider added to what had already been a surreal night. At work, a patient recovering from a procedure had put 20 screws in her shattered femur and then begun bleeding internally. Jane had discovered it while helping her to the bathroom. The patient kept saying that it was just bruising left from the jet ski accident, and then bam, she'd flatlined. When Jane had finally left the hospital at 8:30 that morning, the patient was still in surgery, and the outcome hadn't been good. It took hours for the combined adrenaline of the patient's emergency and the spider's invasion to wear off so Jane could sleep. When her alarm sounded, Jane was already half conscious, trying to ignore a lump in the couch cushion that bit into her thigh. Her daily inspirational quote appeared with pink and purple hearts on her phone screen. When you say it's hard, it means I'm not strong enough to fight for it. Stop saying it's hard. Think positive. Because one explanation point wasn't enough, the message had 3. Jane gave her phone a good shake and asked how positively it would be thinking if she only recharged it for 2 minutes instead of 30. She dragged herself into a sitting position and kicked at the bottom of the couch. Time to start the day. Taco Bell was, in fact, the savior of bad planners and the ill-prepared, which applied to Jane most of the time. Jane piloted her Jeep through the asteroid field of the LA freeway system while eating a taco and singing along with Elton John. Her singing poured out the windows into a smoggy afternoon dusk, almost carefree. Still, she felt a nudge at the back of her head that something was wrong. She pushed it away with rational justifications. The spider invasion, a patient who might now be dead. But it was more than that. An entire chorus of Rocket Man passed while Jane flitted through the possible things wrong that might be bothering her until she found the right one. I didn't arm the alarm. Jane stomped the brake and swerved into the oncoming exit ramp. 2 lanes of drivers laid on their horns in righteous fury. Elton carried on his merry singing, oblivious, while Jane calculated the time it would take to turn around, drive home, arm the alarm, and start off again. In the past, she'd forgotten, and it had been okay, but with the spider and the patient last night, Jane felt the universe conspiring against her more than usual.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Inside the Minds of Authors. Hope you guys are doing amazing. Today, I have the fabulous Miss Jaye with us today. Hi, madam. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
I am excited you're here and can't wait to get started. You are giving us a tease of a pseudo Romeo and Juliet probably going really, really bad. So let's jump in and tell us, where did this idea for this story come from and where did you decide to put it together? Give us the inside of this. What's going on here?
It began actually from a writing conference where the keynote speaker encouraged us to write what we were afraid of. And at the conference, I laughed and I thought, I'm good. I'm not really afraid of anything worth writing about. And I moved on with my life. And then 6 months later, I came into my kitchen in the dark at night and I had nearly stepped on a spider that was about the size of the radius of my hand. And I was terrified and basically had, several months of not feeling safe in my home, and I was like stopping up all the doors and trying to barricade. Like, we're on the third floor. There was no reason there should be a spider in my kitchen. So that was the beginning of it. And I was thinking about the way that fear seeps into regular life in different ways that, it was just an incident that happened once, but then all of a sudden I was reconsidering my lifestyle, my living situation, how I went about my life when I came home from work. So it started with that. And then it also started with this idea that I wanted to write a novel about the perspective of someone from the Midwest who is going to a coast. And often someone who lives in the middle of the country, there's feeling that the people on the not middle of the country have somehow better lives or are clearer thinkers or wiser, et cetera, et cetera. And so I really wanted to write about this conflicts of cultures between what is kind of the middle country where I come from and then the urban coastal city country. And that kind of formed the story where I was thinking about assumptions about culture and assumptions about how you're supposed to live your life. And then I turned it into a romance because that's what you do to make such really boring regular life things exciting. And I put it in Hollywood, which also makes things very exciting.
That is such an interesting combination of things. And, regular life can be exciting in a strange sort of way. Your spider situation would have terrified me. Oh my God, how did you survive that?
Actually, it didn't go well. That's like 7, 8 years ago now, but it was really hard.
Because I'm trying to think, what do you do when you find a spider like that? Because I don't think I'm normally afraid of them, but every time they're in the house, I have to kill them. So I'm like, I might be terrified of spiders. I just don't know how to admit this to myself. But that is absolutely one of those things that you're going, oh God, oh God. Because I feel the same way about cockroaches. I'm like, what is going on in my life? And do I need to move places? You had taken such a traumatic thing and flipped it inside the book because you were talking about her situation with the spider. And literally one simple incident can change your whole entire day, your whole life. How do you get that through your writing to this character that we just kind of got a glimpse of her life? How did she survive this?
Well, that's a good question. And I think about survival, that it's possible to get through one day at a time, and we call that survival. And I think what was interesting to me about Jane is that she is surviving, but she's not thriving. And so in the scene that I just read, she's doing her life. She has a job. She's going to make it to her job sort of on time. But she's been in that situation of almost failing for so long, and it's just exhausting. And what I wanted to do was give her a story where she started kind of coming to terms with the condition of her life and beginning to move forward from that fear and make something new. And I think when you're coming from a place of fear, it's really hard to get out of that routine because it becomes your new normal. And for me, with my incident with the spider, that was definitely a thing, like trying to figure out how I could pull myself out of that cycle of fear to, trust my environment again. I'm still not quite there. And I don't think that there's an easy way to say, oh, yeah, solve the problem. Life is great now. But to move forward in that and kind of give Jane a sense of being able to trust at least her own decisions was something I wanted to do.
You then again added a romance story between families that don't get along with each other. Families are in complete conflict with each other, not quite helping Jane's master plan in getting better with her life. Why romance? Because you could have put this in a mystery, you could have added anything to this. Why a romance story with conflicting families?
Oh, I think that love is one of our most universal things, and especially our desires. And it's also something that's very easy to understand in that to some extent we all want to be loved. And when I say romance, I fan the definition a little bit to think that this is self-love story as much as it is a fall in love with another person. And both of the main characters, Jane and the love interest Daniel, have these character arcs where they're figuring out who they are as individuals and how to accept themselves as individuals, and they do that through their relationship with each other. I will admit that the making it into a romance was not my idea. I was told that that's a good choice to sell books, and that because like the elements of the relationship were there already, that if I made it a more like the romance as the main story instead of their individual journeys, it made more sense. And I think that's true.
As long as it continues to add to the story, it makes sense. Sometimes trying to force a genre into something because it might fit tends to become a little bit difficult for the writer. It makes it painful to survive that mystery.
Right.
So I'm glad it fit. I'm glad it went very well into what you were writing. You talked about writing in terms of bringing this perspective into the coast and the different cultures. When you were exploring these themes, how deep into them did you went? Because I went from the East Coast to Texas, and there's a whole different dynamics that I tend to sometimes take it for granted since I've been here for so long.
So I have spent a lot of time specifically in California, which is where the novel takes place in Los Angeles. And then to fill in my gaps, I did a lot of research. So I talked to friends who lived there for the scene that we just read, experiencing the highway traffic. I think there's like 3 scenes of Jane sitting in her car on the freeway, which I think is part of life in Los Angeles in a kind of third character sort of way. And then I also read a lot about Hollywood. I read autobiographies of former Hollywood heartthrobs and to try and experience not just what it's like in California, but what it's like being in Hollywood as these cultural icons. Because for Daniel and his family, they're not regular people, right? His brother's a blockbuster movie star. And so I wanted to understand what it's like to be in California as this apex of culture where you're making meaning for the rest of the world sometimes, but you're also a real human and how those interact. And to try and figure out, how does a regular person like Jane become involved with this family and how they fall in love. And so I had a lot of help along the way with that part. And then in terms of representing my own culture from the Midwest, I think, every story takes kernels of truth and then changes them to fit the story, not necessarily lying, but maybe exaggerating. And for the Midwestern part of it, there is to some degree an exaggeration of the things that are foundational to how I see the world and how generally people from the Midwest see the world, and this kind of valuing of interpersonal relationships and being very casual and also describing your whole life story to a complete stranger, even though they didn't ask for it, in my experience, is not something that happens in Los Angeles. So there's little things like that. Yeah, you're like, no, we don't do that.
It doesn't happen in New York or Massachusetts either. Trust me. You don't have those conversations. Nor do people wave at you when you walk by. That doesn't happen very often. Those are really fun topics to tackle because it's within the United States, it's within our own hemisphere that we take for granted. We take for granted how hard it is to go from one coast to the other or just being in the middle. So I'm excited to see them play out in your book. And traffic is huge. If you live in a metropolis, this is something everybody talks about. Even here in Dallas, everybody complains when you go to Dallas how much the traffic is. And I'm like, oh my God, I hate driving in it. So thank you. I appreciate it. So tell us, how long did it take you to put this book together?
So I started writing in 2012, and I naively thought it was done in 2013, and then I thought it was done in 2016, and then I thought it was done in 2018. So there have been various permutations over we're going on almost 10 years now. It was picked up by my publisher in the fall of 2019. And so at that point, it did its final permutation and then it was done. So I guess it was finished much longer than what I wanted. But I think, to think about what an author wants to be done, like when the story is complete for me, there's a twofold answer. And the one is that, well, it was done with that first draft because that really was what the story I wanted to tell. And then it's also never done because I'm still thinking about those characters and I have pages and pages of story that didn't make it into the novel. And I'm still thinking about, what would a sequel look like? What do short stories look like with these characters?
I was going to ask if you were interested in making this into a series or they were going to get more out of this, but you're thinking about it. Are you thinking considering doing it more? Or is it going to be like, this might be a standalone? Should we do something else? What is your heart telling you?
I would love to do more. I think, that usually depends on other people when you're publishing books. I have thought about self-publishing a novella involving the antagonist of the story, but I also haven't quite figured out the legal ramifications of that yet and how much my publisher owns compared to what I own at this point. So we're going to have that conversation eventually. And then because I always am doing so many projects, it's more a question of finding the time and space to focus on those characters again instead of just having them drift around in my head.
You mentioned projects. What else are you working on? Tell us.
Right now, I just actually finished the revisions for a far future cyberpunk novel that involves a woman going to a dome city in Nebraska, where she's going to have a job turning the dome into green spaces. She's going to put gardens of real plants in this artificial environment. And she finds out that the person who's hired her for this dream job is maybe not so honest as one would hope, and also has all of these, secret machinations that are going to pull our main character along sort of against her will. And then she gets to decide, when she's going to push back against that and make her own plants. The plants are carnivorous, and they've been genetically adapted to work with an environment that's been ruined by plastic, which I imagine is fairly realistic for our future. And so the dome is also made of plastic. And so there's this idea that we're not quite sure how safe it is to plant gardens of carnivorous plants in an environment where they can eat the structures.
That is pretty fun. And I'm going, oh, that's a recipe for disaster. What made you decide to change genres? Or do you just jump around between one and the other?
Well, you're asking a question of, do you choose to write your stories or do they choose you? Right? And
True.
Right. So I mostly write what we would consider moderate to hard science fiction, but I dabble in almost everything that's considered speculative. So I have an epic fantasy novel I've been toying with. Like I said, Jane of Battery Park is often considered speculative because it involves a terrorist organization that puts celebrities on trial for their sins, which we don't have yet. And it also involves placebo birth control, which we don't quite have in the way that is in my novel yet. Although I'm sure those are probably things people have thought about. So in that way, it is considered a speculative novel, although it is much more mainstream than my other work.
For our listeners who are not familiar, what is a speculative novel? Let's talk about that, because I'm sure people are going, what does that mean? We haven't had an author in this category. Tell us about it. What is it?
Speculative is a very, very broad umbrella term for basically anything that doesn't quite exist in our universe yet. So under that umbrella, you have the science fiction and fantasy, and horror usually is all part of that. But then you also have things like my book that don't quite fit, that look like our regular world, except for one or two things. So magical realism often falls under speculative. Most of what Margaret Atwood has written, even though it looks familiar to us, is very much speculative, where we are speculating about a world that's like ours, but not quite.
That is really fun. And I know some people would have been like, what is that? And do I know it? And I'm pretty sure a lot of us are familiar with it. They probably haven't heard the term. So I'm glad you explained it to us. And it's so easy to grasp. So I appreciate it. So tell us, Madam, in your writing journey, what are some of the things you have learned?
I've learned the difference between writing on your own and writing with other people, in that when you have a book idea and you want to write the story, that's something you do on your own. But bringing that idea to the world, however you're publishing, has to involve other people, and it has to involve some kind of buy-in and money, which is kind of an evil word. I had no idea how many people actually have to be involved in making a book successful. And one of the things that has been really interesting this year is collecting other authors who are also going to support and talk about my book, so that, in the dark void of the internet, you don't just launch something into silence, but you have people that are working on the algorithms that are trying to make your post more visible so that someone actually sees them that wants to read your book. And I think that's kind of like the chief thing about any kind of publishing, is that you can have a book deal finally, or you can finally be able to hit the button on Amazon and publish your book, but there's no guarantee people are going to find it. And it can be the greatest book and people won't find it. And so that need for other people, at the very end, at the very least, not to mention like design and editing, bling, is to make sure that you actually have a chance. And I had no idea how many people you needed for that. So that's been exciting.
It is an entire village to bring these babies to life.
Yeah.
After you've gone through your writing career and you have done all these different projects and you're now bringing these projects to life, what advice would you give a brand new author?
So I think there's the traditional advice is always keep writing no matter what, which is still good. But I think specific to my experience, this idea of writing as a community is something that people can start right away, whether you're doing National Novel Writing Month in November, or if you're just figuring out a forum or a social media hashtag, to begin kind of developing a community of writers. And we always say, well, you have a writing group, But I think it's more than that, where because we have the internet now and we're moving much more online than when I started writing, there's a need for you to start early to kind of build those roots of being online and being part of communities online, because those are the people that are going to give you jobs when you want to publish things, or if you want to be a guest editor somewhere, and when you want to publish your book. And you can do that without really knowing what you're going to publish or what kind of author you're going to be.
That is very, very good for everybody who's listening is how do you get this community going and how do you get this tribe? It's hard because most of us are very introvert. So now you're asking an introvert, hey, go play outside with a bunch of strangers and get together. So when you started working with this, especially if you didn't know, how would you go about talking to a bunch of groups of people that you don't know? Like, what would you tell people how to do it?
So the first thing I did was I dyed my hair blue. And what happens is that when you have blue hair, people come and talk to you, which is easier than talking to strangers. But not everyone can do that. So I recognize that's as an introvert, I think to be a professional writer, a professional anything, you have to interact with people to some extent. And so figuring out your limits and what you're comfortable with is important. I started with one platform. I started on Twitter with the writing community hashtag there, which was very overwhelming at first. But when I started, being intentional about 10 minutes a day, I could kind of figure out, what people were there at the same time I was and kind of build relationships with them. And so it made it a large task, very small and easy for me to manage without feeling like I was exhausted or there was a requirement to be on social media. And I built from there based on my comfort zone. I now spend most of my time on Instagram and on Facebook, which has to do a little bit with my age. I know that cool people who are younger don't use Facebook anymore. That's okay. Hanging out with other authors and intentionally commenting on their posts. So I actually have a group of authors that when they post, they send me a message. Their post goes to my message box. So I see them. So I don't have to spend a lot of time on social media looking for something to say. I'm actually, responding to friends. And that's made it a lot less overwhelming and a lot less scary. And at least for me and my introverted self, like I don't feel like I have to find something cool to say. I don't even try that anymore.
Those are really practical, very hands-on approaches. And they're realistic because sometimes, let's be honest, the internet can be overwhelming. There's too much of too much everywhere. And you're going, okay, what do I do? And do I jump into TikTok now? Do I do Clubhouse? And I'm like, this list doesn't stop. Okay, we just like, what do we do? I like what you said. You pick one that you're comfortable and then you moved on as you became much more familiar and you decided what you like. So perfect. So, madam, I'm so glad you joined us. It's been so much fun. Are you ready to jump to the lightning round?
I think so. Yes.
Okay. Easy peasy. Don't think too much about it. And by the way, I love the blue hair. Looks amazing. So let's do this. Coffee or tea?
Coffee. I've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, actually, since I listened. I think it's
Fair
coffee.
enough.
It's coffee.
Okay. We'll go with that. Sweet or sour?
Sweet.
Nice. Rock and roll or classical music?
Both. Mostly classical music.
All good. Fall or winter?
Winter.
I'm a fall kind of girl, but I'll give you winter. It's all good. So this is a little different. Let's see how you do. If your main character had a theme song, what would it be?
So in my head, although I had to take it out for copyright reasons, Jane actually does have a theme song. And it's The Bitch Is Back from Elton John, which has a lot of double meaning in that I think she's a very nice Midwestern person who, when she finally achieves her own independence, is going to be a little bit bitchy, but she's not there yet. But the rest of the world, because she's betrayed her family values, thinks that she is in fact a bitch. So I always think about that song when I write her.
Perfect. I love it. Awesome. Madam, it's been a pleasure. Tell us, where can our listeners find you, where they can find the book, where we can learn more about you?
Yep, I have a website that's my name, so it's just jayeviner.com, so JAYEVINER.com. My book is available anywhere that you buy books. Highly recommend you going to your local independent bookstore and asking them to order it for you, but I know not everyone can do that. You can also request it from your local library, and I think they would gladly purchase it for you and then also tell you when it has arrived. I hang out on Twitter, as I said, and I'm also mostly on Instagram. I do have TikTok, but you probably won't find anything meaningful there.
I love it. I'm glad we can find you. There's a website, there's Instagram, there is Twitter. People can find you. They can find the book. I love the options you give everybody where they can order, which is awesome as well. So listeners, go pick up this fun adventure. Miss Jaye, it has been a pleasure. Do you have any closing remarks for us?
I don't think so. This is my first podcast, so thank you, DC, for having me, and I've enjoyed being here today.
I am so glad you joined us, and welcome to the world of podcasting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. Remember, we have a brand new author coming up next week. Thank you, Miss Jaye. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, go ahead, join the Patreon community, patreon.com/authordc, and I'll see you again next week. Bye, everyone.